Well, I don't actually have a title, but I thought I'm the librarian at Trinity College, Cambridge. And well, as Alois said at the start, at your last meeting in 2019, my then colleague Jonathan Smith came to talk about, I think, about copyright at that point. And Jonathan retired from as archivist of Trinity College in 2020. In fact, he's still working. I saw him last week, and he's still working on Wittgenstein, among other things. But in his successor as archivist hasn't been working directly on the Wittgenstein Nachlass. So I think it effectively meant that those obligations fell to me as librarian. And my purpose today, I think, is mainly to tell you about some various new acquisitions that have been made in the last 5 or 7 years. So some of you may know about some of them, but I think they're rather miscellaneous, but I'll give a brief introduction to some of them. And in fact, to go back a little bit beyond that, the Nachlass, the part of the Nachlass which is in Cambridge, was at first on loan to the library from the trustees, and then was given outright, and then later the copyrights were assigned to the college. But that has always been, of course, the central part of the Wittgenstein papers that are held in Trinity has been that part of the Nachlass. But so it has never been. The college has never been systematically collecting, for example, correspondence, although there are several collections of letters from Wittgenstein which have been given to the college at various stages. I think the first of those was the letters from Wittgenstein to Norman Malcolm, which he had published himself and then transferred to the trustees, and then it was formed part of the donation with the Nachlass. And then later von Richt gave his letters from Wittgenstein to Trinity, and gradually that collection has built up. And then after Piero Schrafer's death in 1983, his papers, his Nachlass, as well as his library, were given to the college. But the letters of Wittgenstein to Schrafer were not among that archive. Some of you will know a lot about this already, but it seems that well, they left Schrafer's possession sometime before his death, and they came up for sale in 2004, and in fact in 2 installments, rather peculiarly, and the college tried to claim possession of them as part of the estate of Schrafer, but it was impossible to prove that they rightfully belonged to him at the time of his death, and therefore they were purchased by the college. So they don't form part of the Nachlass. Well, of course they don't, but they also don't form part of the Wittgenstein collection as such. They were, or even Schrafer's papers, because they were received later in 2004. So they are now, we call them an additional manuscript because they're additional to the major collections of the library. And those letters were published then by Brian McGuinness. And I just thought I'd quickly show you on our archives catalogue. Well, there are various ways of searching, but if I just, probably the quickest way is just to search it, Wittgenstein Schrafer as a simple search. Well, the reason it comes up with 2,335 results is meaningless, actually, because every record to do with Schrafer has the word Wittgenstein in it, because it's in the description of his. It's impossible to describe Schrafer's life without mentioning the word Wittgenstein. But the results are sorted in, well, in a rather arbitrary ranking we call relevancy ranking, but you can do more refined search. But if I just take, for example, I don't know which one this is. This is just one of about, I think, 85 letters from Wittgenstein to Schrafer. In our catalogue now, well, this is a particularly uninteresting one. There's the summary of says, sends Schrafer aftershave. But if you want, all of these we have digitized, and it will come up. This collection of letters has now been digitized, and you can see the letter there on our website. Dear Shaffer, this is good for cats, etc. after shaving, and has a very agreeable smell. Yours, L.W., Professor of Cosmetics. Now, there are, of course, much more profound letters from Wittgenstein to Schaffer, and it's a really significant collection in terms of the development of some of his ideas. That I thought I'd alert you to the fact that these are available on our website. Maybe in due course we could supply them to Beg, and maybe also we should discuss whether we should bring the images of the more important Wittgenstein manuscripts into this website so that they can be seen alongside that. So that maybe that's a point for discussion over lunch or later on. So there are a few hundred letters of Wittgenstein of various sorts on our website in this format. But more recently, there have been a few more accessions. Wittgenstein's letters to Schaffer were this is just a few of the things I will talk about. Wittgenstein's letters to Schaffer were, as I said, mainly acquired en bloc in 2004, but a few have come up on the market more recently. It seems that the collection, we don't know exactly where it was. It was slightly dispersed before being offered. What we were told in 2004 was the complete collection was not complete. So this letter, for example, from 1934, came up for sale in an auction in Stargard in Berlin. And again, I questioned in 2017, I questioned the provenance. I got no straight answer, but we bought it. I resented buying it because I don't think that we needed to part with money for it. It's not actually a terribly important or interesting letter. It seems to be a rather defensive letter after Wittgenstein had had some sort of argument with Schaffer the previous day. So he says this is likely to become a long letter, but in fact it's quite a short letter. But he talks about, he says he's unable to understand, he apologizes for being unable to explain himself in a way in which Schaffer can understand. And in fact, a bit later at the top of this page, he says the other thing that among the other things makes it impossible for you to follow the way I think is a certain kind of crookedness of my thoughts. I don't mean a blame. They are very often doing such things like looping the loop. And it's an interesting phrase for the way in which Wittgenstein failed to make his argument clear to Schaffer. Then, when I bought that letter from Stargard, I asked them to reassure me that there were no more from the same consignor. And they said, in fact, they have another letter of 12 pages, 6 sheets, 12 sides. This one, also from 1934, from the 11th of March. Thankfully, although the envelopes are not kept, Schaffer meticulously annotated them with the dates. All the letters that he kept, which were, there are also 100 letters from Maynard Keynes, for example. He kept them, he wrote the date in pencil. So even though it was not Wittgenstein's habit to be so meticulous about dating his letters, and he merely wrote Sunday, thankfully we know it was Sunday the 11th of March 1934. Now this letter, I said, is rather more interesting. Again, it begins apologetically about the nature of, well, it's a very broad, I won't even try to summarize the letter. I think that it starts apologetically with some of the reasons why their conversation descended in the way that it had, and then he needed to continue it in writing, which you have to remember that although Wittgenstein and Schaffer both lived in Trinity College, they were at other ends of it. Wittgenstein in the tower at the top of the far end of Whewell's Court, and Schaffer in his rooms right next to the Wren Library. So it was a good 2-minute walk between them. And it was much more economical for Wittgenstein to write a 12-page letter to his friend than to go and talk to him. And he continues, so this letter, as it continues, it's just behind me here. There's an interesting section here where he says, I never said that the Austrians couldn't go fascist because it was incompatible with their mentality. I said that I could not imagine how this change could take place. The mistake I made was that I called fascism a kind of physiognomy, and my difficulty was, how can the Austrian face change into that face which I called fascism? To answer this should have been, fascism isn't a face, but a form of government, etc., etc., though it is true that the face of Austrian fascism won't be like the face of German and Italian fascism, still the form of government, etc., etc., will be the fascism. It is as though I had asked, how can this man get drunk? I know that drunkard I know what drunkards look like and can never look like those, and he can never look like those I've seen. So it carries on in this way. It's a really interesting, I haven't come across other letters from this period, from early 36, where Wittgenstein talks about the possibility of, or rather in this case, the impossibility of Austrian fascism. And I think, Wittgenstein's letters to Schaffer are one of the places where he discusses these political ideas much more intensely than in any other correspondence. So anyway, this letter continues for some time. It then goes into other subjects and then concludes. I will not go on because I'm not clear-headed enough at present and could not make even a modestly decent job of the argument. He doesn't sign it off. He never did. He never bothered to sign his letters to Schaffer. Well, only occasionally. Earlier in their correspondence, he would write Ludwig Wittgenstein, occasionally later, as in that aftershave when it was signed LW, Professor of Cosmetics. But normally, he just stops abruptly at the bottom of the page. Sometimes he starts without any salutation as well, which makes it quite difficult to be sure of whether we have a complete letter, because unless it breaks off mid-sentence, you can't be certain whether it is the end of the letter. Anyway, those are two more letters of Wittgenstein that have arrived more recently in the library. There are a few other very minor ones. Recently, I went to visit the widow of Theodore Redpath, who many of you will know wrote a short book about his work with Wittgenstein, although he was professor of English. And she had a few letters of Wittgenstein, which are now in our possession, but they're very insignificant in their content. They're merely making arrangements for visits, so they have no philosophical or political or other content. And they're known from he didn't publish the letters in his account, but they don't add anything new to our knowledge of Wittgenstein. And so I haven't included those just here. Perhaps more interestingly, 3 years ago, the library was given a large archive of letters from Georg Kreisel. Kreisel had maintained his connections with Trinity long after he left for Stanford, and his papers are mainly kept in Stanford. But every week from 1967 until his death, he would write a long letter to a friend of his, a Frenchman called Monsieur Hubert Faure, who lived in London, and he was a businessman. I don't know, I wasn't able to find out how they met, but he treated it as his journal. He would write a 10-page or maybe longer letter every week to his friend Faure, and Monsieur Faure contacted me and asked me if we would like to receive this collection of letters from Kreisel. Now, Kreisel is terribly significant in the understanding of Wittgenstein, but in fact, not many of these letters are directly relevant to Wittgenstein. But I thought I should alert you to them because I think there are In fact, he discusses Gödel much more than Wittgenstein in the correspondence, but there are several thousand letters. It's a massive archive, and it's really fascinating for the life of Kreisel in particular. So that archive we've received, and we can make it available, but it isn't catalogued in any detail yet. The letters are very intense and gossipy, and we may need to decide to reserve some of them because Kreisel had a lot of affairs with various people, which are quite documented in quite a lot of detail in these letters, some of them people who are still alive. But it's an interesting and important collection. Monsieur Faure, when I went to see him, was 99 years old, and he asked to bequeath them, and then he died at the age of 101 in 2021. And then the papers came to us just after that. So, but another very small group of letters which was recently acquired are 5 letters to Wittgenstein from Paul Engelmann. Now, these letters have all been published. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, Engelmann wrote a memoir of Wittgenstein in which he published most of the letters that he had received from Wittgenstein, but unfortunately, he didn't include the letters from the time when this house was built. I don't know quite why. I think it was his intention to publish a second edition with all of the letters, but then he died shortly after the edition was published. So when it was later when the complete correspondence, or at least the completer correspondence of Engelmann and Wittgenstein was published in 2006 by Ilse Sommerville, she included these letters, but it's slightly ambiguous in her notes. It's not entirely clear where the letters were at the time of the publication, because we know that the Wittgenstein's letters to Engelmann are in Jerusalem in the National University Library, the National Library of Israel, and some of the other material is in the Brenner Archive in Innsbruck, but it seems that not all of the letters from Engelmann to Wittgenstein are there, and I think it's very likely that these 5 letters were in the possession of Brian McGuinness, and they came up for sale a few months ago from a London dealer who I think had been selling some of Brian McGuinness's papers on behalf of his family. So these letters, there are 5 of them. They're all published by Ilse Sommerville. And I just thought I'd draw attention to one of them in particular, this letter dated the 27th of November 1925, because in this letter, Engelmann, he says, I don't know if you can see it, ich war Anfang November 3 Tage bei ihren Schwester Stoneborough in Gmunden. Sie beabsichtigt, in Wien ein Stadthaus zu bauen. And then he says at the top, sehr gern würde ich mit Ihnen über diese Sache und anderes mit Victor sprechen. So this seems to be the first time at which Engelmann mentions the possibility of building this house. And then he doesn't directly say, I want you to collaborate with me on it, but he does at least state that he wishes to discuss this matter further with Wittgenstein. So I think this is the very beginning of the idea that led to the room in which we are now sitting in November 1925. So it's a nice connection. Now, you could argue that these letters ought really to be in Innsbruck in the Brenner Archive. And, well, maybe we could discuss that later. I'd like to find out more about exactly where the other letters from Engelmann to Wittgenstein are. But perhaps some of you around the room know the answer to that question. Oh, this is the final one. So all of these letters are from 1924 to 1928. Now, so now if we move on from this to some actual texts of Wittgenstein, not just correspondence. This is a typescript of the Grosses format, which was also in the possession of Brian McGuinness. This is one of the 8 typescript copies of the Grosses format recorded by von Richt as being insignificant. He knew of it. It was a copy probably made for Weissmann, possibly by Weissmann. And in fact, in his list, it's known by a name written on the outer cover, VMS, which is either Wittgenstein manuscript or more likely Wittgenstein Moritz Schlick. And this typescript, it's a carbon copy. You can maybe see from this image, but it doesn't seem to be the top copy of this particular typing of the text of Grosses format. Doesn't seem to be any of the others. So it represents a separate typing of an attempt to render the Grosses format as a typescript. So I think it has textual significance in its own right. It seems to be different. I mean, I'm not a scholar of this. My German isn't good enough. My knowledge of Wittgenstein certainly isn't good enough. And the Grosses format is particularly complicated because there are these many typescript copies. But even if you compare, just by comparing the text of the manuscript with the type copy, it's clear that it isn't a direct copy. It's not merely that decisions have been made about what to include or exclude. On every page, the typescript is, I think, 36 pages, and on every page there are a few small and maybe not terribly significant textual variants. There's a different word rather than a misunderstanding of what Wittgenstein wrote. So this seems to be a dictation. I mean, it's more likely to be a dictation than a transcription with the Grosses format in front of the typist. But it's very difficult. I think all of these typescripts raise those sort of questions of what exactly do we mean by diktat? Because if every one of them is different, is that because the person typing the copy heard Wittgenstein say a different word, or is it because the typist misunderstood? I think they can often, I mean, I feel uncomfortable saying any of this to those of you who've spent many decades working on exactly this question, but I think every new source like this raises very intense problems of the textual filiation between a manuscript by Wittgenstein and the type copy, which may have been made by a professional typist based on shorthand that's made by one of Wittgenstein's students, or may have been typed by one of Wittgenstein's students directly, and whether shorthand was expanded into a different word from what Wittgenstein said. That would be a reason for making the word in the typescript less significant than the version in the manuscript. But there are other ways in which one could argue that the typescript can be superior. So these are questions that need to be asked with every new typescript. So this is just another new typescript. In fact, this we haven't yet digitized. We should give copies to Alois. I hope it won't cause too many problems to add another one to your collection. Then earlier this year, I received an unexpected package which contained 2 copies of the Brown book. Now they're labeled on the front cover, copy 2 and copy 3. This is interesting. I've looked at as many copies of the Brown book as I could find, and I don't think both of these are carbon copies where copy 1 must have been the top copy. But I haven't found copy 1 in this particular typing of the Brown book. On the title page, it just says The Brown Book, notes dictated to Francis Skinner and Ambrose, 1934 to 35, by Ludwig Wittgenstein, brackets unofficial. Now, different versions of the Brown Book have different renderings of the title and different explanations of what they constitute. This copy, I haven't been through every word of it yet, but it seems to me that the text is identical to the typed copy that von Richt used as the basis of the edition. But interestingly, the diagrams, well, some of them are diagrams, but actually most of them, I think, under your definition, there probably aren't. There's some that may be figures, and there are a few that are drawings. But in these two copies, copy 2 and copy 3, the drawings, diagrams, figures are certainly in the hand of Francis Skinner, and they are better. They seem to me clearer than the versions in von Richt's copy, and therefore I hope would be considered superior and closer to what Wittgenstein intended, because I think Skinner had the closest understanding and knowledge of what it was that he was producing in these typed copies. They weren't typed by Skinner himself. I'm pretty sure that they were typed by a typing agency. Although I can't prove that. That's more to do with the way in which they're bound. They look like the product of they're very neatly typed, and I don't think that Skinner did that himself. So in fact, that made me wonder whether they'd been copied directly from Skinner's manuscript copy of the Brown Book, or of the text that we know as the Brown Book, which, as you probably know, I mean, this is one of it's in several of these typed volumes similar to the other Brown Book. These volumes are part of the archive of Francis Skinner, which came to light, I think, 15 years ago, in the possession of the London Mathematical Society, and has been placed on loan in Trinity College to be alongside the Nachlass. Some of the other volumes in this collection have been more recently edited by Arthur Gibson, who I think spoke about it at the last meeting here in 2019. But the Brown Book, the text of what we know as the Brown Book, in the Skinner, it's not really a Skinner Nachlass. It's a small collection, but it's only part of what Skinner. But these are things that were retained by Wittgenstein himself as being significant from among Skinner's papers. They include this manuscript, which is basically the text of the Brown Book, but with many corrections by Wittgenstein, in Wittgenstein's hand, in this volume. But those have not been incorporated into the typescripts that recently arrived. So it suggests to me, I mean, Arthur Gibson didn't do this in his edition. He didn't edit the Brown Book, re-edit the Brown Book, but I think that these images of Skinner's manuscript copy of the Brown Book with Wittgenstein's corrections ought really to supersede the existing editions, or at least to become a new source to look at in parallel with the published editions of the Brown Book. And again, we do have images of these, which I still need to supply to Alois, but I need to get the permission of the London Mathematical Society to do that. So I will attend to that in due course. I don't really have anything to say in summary. I suppose I didn't tell you where that package with the 2 copies of the Brown Book came from. Those copies prepared by Skinner were, I think, given to Casimir Levy, who then gave them to Ian Hacking. So Hacking was Levy's student, and Ian Hacking died earlier this year. And so they came from his estate, and I'm glad that they found their way back to the archive. Casimir Levy I don't think There's a small collection of his papers in the University Library in Cambridge, and in fact, a few letters from Wittgenstein came up for sale separately. They weren't connected with Ian Hacking. They came up for sale in Bonham's sale room auction house in London earlier this year. And I don't know where they ended up, unless you bought them, Alfred. I forgot to ask you. But anyway, they were not very important letters, in my opinion. They were to do with the editing of Mind at the time, and Levy was the editor of Mind, but he had much more interesting discussions with other people, including G.E. Moore, during that period. Those letters were sold by Levy's family, but these two copies of the Brown Book came from Levy to Ian Hacking and then to Trinity. I think those are the things I was going to mention. If I wanted to talk about future directions that we might take in the library, I would mainly want to ask you for ideas, but one of them is a question of to what extent it's useful to make digital copies of letters, especially when there are good editions of them that are available. Is it helpful to people such as this audience to have readily available copies of the letters themselves, when I would rather encourage people to read them in the editions, because they're then annotated and contextualized in useful ways. But we could carry on doing that with all the remaining letters. We should, I think, add the notebook, the Skinner notebooks, as I mentioned, which are in our possession but not our property. They're owned by the London Mathematical Society. Another big problem I need to think about sometimes is the papers of Rush Rees, which have been deposited. They were given to Trinity College. There's a very summary hand list of them. They largely consist of photocopies of the manuscripts and the notebooks and the typescripts, but some of them are annotated by Rees and Anscombe and others. That collection is massive and it's never been given sufficient attention. There will probably turn out to be certain things in there which are not available in their original copy, so that the photocopy is, or not, with their whereabouts, it may not be presently known. So it would be well worth our while, I think, to go through systematically working out exactly which things are known and which are unknown to the wider community of Wittgenstein scholars. And then there are the papers of the Wittgenstein trustees, which were received gradually in installments, as the trustee body was gradually wound down to one trustee and then assigned to the Master and Fellows of Trinity College, which effectively I'm the representative of the Master and Fellows as the copyright holder, and in one sense, I have the burden of responsibility of all of the trustees on my shoulders, which is rather a large burden, a lesser burden than in 1951, admittedly. But there are still a great number of remaining complexities about the extent to which different copyrights are held in different countries and for different works, which I find it very difficult to get my head around, because I've had a great deal of experience with other estates and with copyright in what I thought were fairly complicated situations, but none of them is nearly as complicated as that of Wittgenstein. The trustees' papers, I would hope, would give me more information about that, but in fact, in many cases they don't. For example, I haven't been able to find contracts in which the copyright was assigned to the publishers of the major editions in the 1960s. And I would have thought that that was the sort of material that a trustee body would feel obliged to retain, because that's the sort of legal evidence of the terms under which assignments were made. That in turn makes it very difficult for me to know whether I'm permitted to assign translation rights to a third party in the text of Wittgenstein. I know I can't in the translations by the trustees, because the period of copyright is still in existence. But I hope that more of that material will gradually emerge from elsewhere, because the papers as they are in a complete state of disarray, but there are several crates of them. There's a large collection of material. More recently, Anthony Kenny sent me some of he found some folders of minutes of the trustees, which I actually found extremely useful because they filled in gaps in the material that we had already. So that material probably, I don't think it would be suitable for digitization, but it needs to be sorted and properly interpreted. I need to get my head around it, basically. And I think that it will overlap to some extent with a lot of the papers in the Rush Rees archive, which probably really belongs in the administrative papers of the trustee body. So those are some problems that I have to look forward to in the future. Maybe when I get home on Saturday, I'll start. I've been putting off looking through the trustee minutes for several years now, and I realise that it will be useful for me to have a fuller understanding of what they were up to between 1951 and 2004. Thank you.